On the pasuk v'shav sa'aretz Shabbos la'Hashem, the land should rest a Shabbos for Hashem. That's on the Shemitah year. The land should rest, and you're not allowed to do any work in the field and the vineyard, etc. The Zoyar, in connection to this, brings the pasuk: Kisikne eved ivri, when you buy a Yiddish slave. Sheishanim yavod, so he works for 6 years. On the 7th year, he goes out free. Says the Zoyar, the Chol Bar Yisrael, every single Yid, has rest on the Shemitah year. So in the time when the land is resting, the avodim, the servants, the slaves, should also rest. And therefore, ubashviyas, on the 7th year, they go out free. Now, seemingly, it seems like the Zoyar is understanding the words of Ashviyas, Yetzi Lachav Shechinam, that on the 7th year he goes out free, that this is referring to not the 7th year from when he was sold and became an Eved, but rather on the Shnas HaShemitah. So the question and the wonder is known regarding this, that it's a clear halacha, a known halacha in so many different places in Chazal, that a slave goes out free not in the year of Shemitah, but rather the 7th year from when he was sold. So how is it that the Zohar is saying that Ba'ahu Naicha Da'ara, at this time when the land is resting, it is appropriate that the slaves should also be getting their rest and therefore go out free? Says the Rebbe, it is not logical to say that the Zohar over here is arguing with all of these Maimorei Chazal in Nigla de Torah. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first prefacing that we find regarding mitzvahs that there's a concept of doing a mitzvah in the way of lichatchila, in the best possible way, right from the start, and there's something called fulfilling the mitzvah in a way of b'di'evid, after the fact. In other words, it's not the most perfect way from the start, but if it was done that way, it's considered doing the mitzvah. It's explained in Acharonim that this difference between lichatchila and di'evid exists even in inyanim of d'oraisa. Furthermore, not only in regards to details of the mitzvah, which seem to be only sort of a side condition or part of the mitzvah, and then you'd be able to understand that even if this little detail or condition is missing, you fulfill the mitzvah at least b'di'evid. But there are cases, rather, that this detail is something very much part of the actual mitzvah itself, very much part of the mitzvah, and nevertheless we say that this condition is not li'ikuva. It doesn't stop you from fulfilling the mitzvah, and you still did the mitzvah b'di'evid, even without that detail. A number of examples are given for this, and the one that's sort of the main one that's given, or the most basic one that's given, is a klal that we say in regards to kachim, in regards to karbonos. So the Gemara says that in karbonos, when the pasuk repeats something, says it a second time, that is when it's la'akiv. That means that this detail about the carbon is an absolute necessity. But if the Torah didn't repeat it, that means these details that the Torah didn't repeat, yes, they're an important part of the carbon, but even if you didn't miss that out, you would still be yaitza. Says the Rebbe, based on this klal, that we have mitzvahs that there is the best way of doing them, and we have mitzvahs that even if you do it and didn't do it in the best way, you still did the mitzvah. Based on this, we'll be able to understand quite a number of things which at the first glance seem quite surprising. And some of them will be explained over here. So for example, something relevant to these days, Sfiras Omer. So in regards to Sfiras Omer, the Pasuk says, Spartam lachem imocharas HaShabbos. You should be counting from the day after Shabbos. Now simply, it sounds like it means Shabbos. In fact, it's Sedukim, the Baisusin said that Shavuos will always fall out on Moitzoi Shabbos, always after Shabbos on a Sunday, because according to them, you always start counting Sfira on Moitzoi Shabbos, the day after Shabbos, as the Pasuk says, Mimocharas HaShabbos. But Torah Sheba'al Peh comes along and explains that no, Mimocharas HaShabbos means, Shabbos over here means Yom Tov. So it means you start counting the day after the Yom Tov, the first day of Pesach. And Chazal bring many proofs for this, and Limudim, how we learn it out, etc. But the question is, since Torah wants us to start counting Mimacharas Yom Tov, meaning the day after the first day of Pesach, so why is it that the Torah would use this expression Mimacharas HaShabbos, which is leaving room for a mistake? Why doesn't the pasuk just say Mimacharas HaPesach or a similar sort of expression? But based on what we just explained, we'll be able to explain it. But by first prefacing that just like you have this idea, lechatchila and b'di'evid, as far as how well the person is fulfilling the mitzvah, in other words, if he missed out on doing a certain detail that wasn't ma'akev, that wouldn't hold you back from doing the mitzvah, then we say you did the mitzvah b'di'evid, so too, in certain cases, there's a situation that as far as the mitzvah itself is concerned, not only the person. So as far as the mitzvah itself, there are certain situations when the mitzvah is done with more shleimus, with more completion, and there is a situation where lechatchila, it was set up that this mitzvah is not going to be done in its fullest, b'shleimus. In other words, certain aspects or details are going to be missing. The Rebbe says one of the most simple and obvious, clear examples for this is we have regarding Yomim Tovim. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Yom Tov was very much connected with the idea of bringing karbonos. There was karbonos Yom Tov of the tzibur, there was karbonos of the individual, Oiloi Suriyah, the carbon that he needs to bring for coming to the Beis HaMikdash, Shalmi Chagiga, a special carbon Shlomim, which is a Chagiga. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, we still have the full Yom Tov Min HaTorah, but we don't have the karbonos. In fact, even in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, if a person didn't own land, then he would be patur, exempt from being oile regel, and therefore he also didn't have to bring these karbonos that we just mentioned, even though he still has the full Yom Tov Min HaTorah. Now it's understood, says the Rebbe, that the karbonos of Yom Tov, and so too the idea of aliyah l'regel, are not just a side detail of the Yom Tov. It's a very much part of the Yom Tov. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, the karbonos are not even, that wouldn't even be called a mesuvav, just a result of the Yom Tov, but rather they're very much a chelek, a part, or at least you could say a hisofa, adding the shleimus of the Yom Tov being in its most complete way. And nevertheless, in a situation where according to Torah the karbonos cannot be brought, there is still the full Yom Tov and the full kedusha of the Yom Tov min HaTorah. The Rebbe looks now at some other examples. The Rebbe says, furthermore, we find that there are certain mitzvahs that were lechatchila given in a way that there are two times of how the mitzvah is being done. And in one of the times, it's going to be with its full details. And at the other time, it's not going to have all of those details. So the Rebbe gives the example of Yom Tov and Chol HaMoed. So Chol HaMoed is part of Yom Tov. It is part of the Moyadim l'Simcha, the Yom Tovim that we have for Simcha, and because of that there are dinim, Yechayiv and Simcha min HaTorah on Chol HaMoed as well. On the other hand, we understand that it still is not anything like the days of Yom Tov itself, which then you have a day of Yom Tov with its fullest completion, with all of the details what a Yom Tov has. Says the Rebbe, we'll now go back to Sfiras Omer. The fact that the Torah says, Usfartum lachem mimacharas HaShabbos, even though the mitzvah of Sfira is to count on the day after Yom Tov, after Pesach, is because when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, when Pesach falls out on Shabbos, and we're going to be counting in such a year, on the day that it's going to be Mimacharas HaShabbos, also in the sense of the day after Shabbos, not only Yom Tov, then according to Chazal, as we'll soon see it more at length, then in that particular case, there is actually more a shleimus. Sfira is in a more perfect way then. In other words, Sfira was lechatchila given in two ways. We have the actual mitzvah of counting, and that obviously you must count, and that's ma'akiv b'di'evid. You have to have this. You're going to have every single year, whenever you count. Whenever the kviyas is going to be, you have to count the full 49 days, and that must be the day after Pesach, the second day of Pesach. But then there is a kviyas when Pesach falls out on Shabbos, when the mitzvah of Sfira is going to be done with more perfection, with more shleimus, with more wholesomeness. And the reason why the Torah then refers to it as Mimacharas HaShabbos is because when it is Mimacharas HaShabbos, the day following Shabbos in the literal sense, then the mitzvah is done with a greater shleimus, with all of its shleimus. The proof of this, says the Rebbe, and the explanation of this, we're going to understand based on a medrash tamua, and something what seems like a surprising medrash, on the pasuk Usfartam lachem mimacharas HaShabbos. And this is what the medrash says. The pasuk says, Sheva Shabbosos tmimois tihiyana. The 7 weeks need to be complete. Says the medrash, when are they considered complete? So the expression of the medrash is, She'ein Yeshua u'shchanya beineihem. What does this mean? So just briefly, the Rebbe doesn't go into all the details right here in the Sicha that I mentioned somewhat in the next little section, but basically there was a mishmaris, there was koyanim divided into different groups, into 24 different groups, and each one worked for a week in the Beis HaMikdash, and then the turns started again. these Mishmoris had different names. So Yeshua and Shchanya are names of two of these families, of two of these Mishmoris. If it happened that Pesach would fall out on Shabbos, so then Yeshua, these two families, Yeshua and Shchanya, wouldn't end up being between Pesach and Shavuos. If Pesach falls out on another day of the week, then these Mishmoris would be there. So the Medrash says, when is it considered Tamimois? When Yeshua and Shchanya are not in between Pesach and Shavuos. Mefarshim explain, in other words, what we just said, that when we count, Mimocharas HaShabbos, if Pesach falls on Shabbos, we're going to start counting on Sunday. That is when it's B'Shleimus. And the Medrash is giving a siman for that Kviyus when Pesach falls on Shabbos, that these Mishmoros, Yeshua and Shchanya, wouldn't be doing Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash in that case, between Pesach and Shavuos. So if we start counting Sfira on Moitzoi Shabbos, Mimocharas HaShabbos, in the literal sense, so then the weeks are complete, like Sheishis Yimei Bereishis. That's what it means complete of it, because it goes from Sunday till Shabbos. On the other hand, if these Mishmaris of Yeshua and Shchanya would be in between Pesach and Shavuos, that's indicating that you didn't start on Shabbos. Pesach was on Shabbos, so you didn't start on Sunday, and then the 7 weeks are not complete. So that's what the Medrash says, according to the way the Mefarshim explained it. So the question is, the obligation of having Tamimois, Sheva Shabbosis Tamimois, is obviously every single year, no matter when Pesach falls out. And that's why, for example, there's some halachas that come out of that if a person forgot to count today, he's not going to be able to count, because then he doesn't have 7 complete weeks. It's also the reason why we count Sfira Soim, where we start at night, because we want it to be the full day of Sfira, the night and the day. So why is the Medrash then saying that when is it Tamimois? Only when Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, seemingly this is leaving room for the opinion of the Baisusim Chas v'Shalom that Sfira is always started on the day after Shabbos, on Sunday, Motzei Shabbos. But as we said before, the explanation is that when we have the weeks complete, like Sheishis Yimei Bereishis, meaning it's going from Sunday to Shabbos, that's the way we're counting Sfira, so the Tamimois are with more Shleimus. In other words, they're more perfect, they're more Tamimois. But this type of Shleimus, this perfection, is something that we don't have to have every year. In other words, what we have to have every year is 49 days. To have this extra perfection of being from Sunday to Shabbos, and therefore complete weeks in that sense, is something that you don't have to have. When is it considered that sort of Tamimois? That's when it follows the days of the week, that Pesach is Shabbos, and Sfira goes from Sunday to Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, if this is in fact the case, if this is true, that Torah sometimes does discuss a mitzvah as it is in its most perfect way, with all of the details. Even though some of these details are actually not ma'akiv b'di'evid, you would be doing the mitzvah even without them. That will also give us explanation in another seemingly very surprising thing in regards to the end of Sfiras Omer when we come to Chag HaShavuos. Regarding the Kviyas of Shavuos, Chazal tell us, Shavuos could sometimes fall on the 5th day of Sivan, sometimes on the 6th day of Sivan, sometimes on the 7th day of Sivan. In other words, it does not always have to be in the time when there would be Mekadesh the months, sanctify the moon, and that's the way the new Rosh Chodesh is, by seeing the moon, etc. So in other words, not necessarily Shavuos would always be on the 6th of Sivan, which is the day of Matan Torah, or according to one opinion, the 7th of Sivan is the day of Matan Torah, but not necessarily Shavuos always would fall out on the day of Matan Torah, because Shavuos could be on one of the other days as well. It could be Hey, Vav, or Zayin. So the question is, and the Rebbe says, we find that Chazal clearly connect the idea of Shavuos with the day of Matan Torah. The Rebbe brings a Yerushalmi that says that the reason by the Korbanos of Shavuos, it doesn't say in the pasuk the expression of Chet. This is referring to the Korbanos that were brought, especially on Yom Tov, by every other Yom Tov. It speaks about bringing a Seir Izim for a Chatos. By Shavuos, it also brings about bringing this goat, but it doesn't say it's for a Chatos. The Chet is not mentioned. So the reason is, says the Gemara, Yerushalmi, since you accepted upon yourself the oil Torah, I consider it as if you'd never sinned. In other words, Shavuos is very much connected with the idea of Kabbalah SaTorah. So how does this fit together with what we're saying, that sometimes Shavuos can be on other days? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, the Toichen of Mitzvah of Sfiras Omer is, of course, a preparation for Kabbalah SaTorah. as explained in the Rishonim in the name of the Medrash, that because of the tremendous anticipation and yearning of the Yidden to Kabbalas HaTorah, that's why when they left Mitzrayim, they were counting of how many days are they closer now to Kabbalas HaTorah. The 49 days of Sfira are Achana to Matan Torah to the 50th day. Or in the language of Chassidus, through the counting of 49 days, which correspond to the 49 gates of Bina, Shari Bina, we reach the 50th gate, Shar Anun, which is the idea of receiving the Torah. So what do we have here? A similar sort of idea. That even though on the one hand, the Sfira was established in a way that the 50th day is not necessarily going to be the time of Kabbalas HaTorah. In fact, it could end up being before Kabbalas HaTorah, it could end up being on Hey Sivan, which is before Kabbalas HaTorah. Yet, when Shavuos, the 50th day, falls out on the day of Kabbalas HaTorah, so it's not just like another additional thing, we also have Kabbalas HaTorah on this day, but obviously bringing a greater shleimus to this day itself. The shleimus of the 50th day, when this day is also the day that we receive the Oila Torah, Matan Torah. And since, says the Rebbe, Shavuos in its most perfect way is when it falls out in the day of Kabbalas HaTorah. That's why, as the Yerushalmi said, the Torah Shemeksav does not say the word Chet by Atzeres, because the ideal, the best possible situation is when Shavuos does fall out together with Matan Torah. We now go back, before that, the Rebbe gives another example, or some more examples. The Rebbe says like this: just like it is in regards to one and the same mitzvah, so do we find sometimes that you can have two mitzvahs which have a certain common theme, and yet you'll see that in one mitzvah, this idea, the idea of the mitzvah, which we're going to give an example in a minute, is being done with a more shleimus, a more perfect way, and by the other mitzvah, it's not to the same extent. So the example the Rebbe gives is Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. So it consists of two different mitzvahs. There is an obligation to tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, the night of Tezvav Nisan. There's also the obligation of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim throughout the whole year. Every day we need to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim. Now, even though they're both the same idea, remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim, and nevertheless there's quite a number of differences in the way the mitzvah is fulfilled. The way we remember Yitzias Mitzrayim all year round is not with all of the details and in such an emphasized way as the obligation of Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach. And the reason is obvious. The time of Yitzias Mitzrayim simply was on the night of Tezvav Nisan, and therefore remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim on this night is going to be in its most perfect way. Whereas the obligation of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim the rest of the year is as a result of Pesach and the obligation of the night of Pesach. Since the idea of Yitzias Mitzrayim, we say, is really something that is an ongoing, it's a continuous thing that we go out of Mitzrayim, therefore, and that it has an impact on us all the time. Therefore, the Chiyuv Yitzias Mitzrayim is all year round. But therefore, we understand that this remembrance is not going to be to the same extent, with the same shleimus, as the Schira of the night of Pesach. The Rebbe gives another example. The Rebbe says a similar idea, although it's not connected directly with a mitzvah, we find in a Mishnah that again, Ba'ashkaf Rishon at first glance seems very, very surprising. So the Mishnah says, Eiluhein hamemunin shahayu b'migdash. For different tasks, for different jobs, for different things in the Beis HaMikdash, there was different memunim. There were people appointed over different jobs. Now the Mishnah enumerates the names of these people, and for which avodah, or which idea in the Beis HaMikdash, each one of them would be memuna. For example, it says Yochanan ben Pinchas was the memuna al hachisomis. Chisomis were like tokens. The person gave in the token, and for that he got. He bought this token, and later he would use that for the karbonis, etc. What does it mean? Now the Mishnah is enumerating specific names. Now, obviously, these names were not the same people over all the generations. So the Mefarshim explain two reasons what these names are. Either Ksheirei Kol Dor V'Dor, these were the most worthy of over all the generations. The Mishnah is choosing the ones that were the very, very best, the most suitable, the best people that were the Memunim. So mentioning one of each. Another answer is given, another explanation is given, is that the Tana is mentioning the people that were in his generation. But the question is, why would the Mishnah, which is the Inyan of Halacha, why would it mention names? This is clearly something of many generations earlier. Why would it be relevant to later generations? The names that were once upon a time. Similar to like the Shas will sometimes ask, "My dahava hava," whatever happened, happened. Why is it relevant? Specific names, who were the Mamuna at a particular time. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand it based on what the Rav says. The Bartanura says that which names are being mentioned over here? The first people, the first ones that were appointed for these jobs had these names, and as a result of that, therefore, all of the following people that had that same job, that had that same task, were called by the name of that first person that had this job. Why? The question is, this is the question, why would you call someone later with the same name as a person that had it, the job a previous time? So if we gave the example, the Rebbe doesn't give this example, but the Rebbe brought an example before. There was Yochanan ben Pinchas Zalach Chisomis. So you're telling me that in every generation, the person in charge of these tokens is going to be called Yochanan ben Pinchas. Like, why would you call someone in a later generation based on the previous generations? So the Rebbe says, we can explain it in the following way. A name, as we know, always expresses the characteristics, the nature of the person who has the name. Chazal tell us, Reb Meir Avedayik Bishmar, Reb Meir would look at a name of a person and he would connect it with the character of that person. So in our case, the fact that certain people were chosen to be the Mamunim, to be appointed on particular aspects of the Beis HaMikdash, is clearly because these particular ideas in the Beis HaMikdash needed people that had these characteristics as these people that were chosen. Now, because we said the name of a person is connected to his character, so this character that's needed for this particular job will also be hinted in his name. And these were the names of the people that were originally chosen. Now, in every single generation, when we're going to need to appoint people for this particular thing, we're again going to be looking for someone that's suitable for this job and really suitable, really, to that name as well. Even though practically you might not have that name. The Rebbe says from the actual fact that the later Mamunim, the people appointed in later generations had a different name, it's only that they were being called by the name of the previous generations. That tells us that by these later generations, they only had something similar to the original characteristics that were needed, but not with the same shleimus or the same perfection as the original Mamunim that had those names and were chosen for those tasks. The Rebbe comes now to the Zoya regarding Shemitah and the Avodim. Says the Rebbe, as we discussed earlier, just like in regards to Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim that we said, there's the main time of the mitzvah. And then there's a mitzvah similar to it, but it's not with all of the details because it originates from that other mitzvah. Says the Rebbe, we can now understand in regards to the Zoyar and the year of Shemitah. There is the Shemitah of Klal Yisrael, Shnasa Shemitah. But there's also the idea that an individual has his own, so to speak, his 7th year. In this case, we're speaking about the 7th year from when a slave was sold. Now, since both of them are considered Shvius, they're both the idea of the 7th year, it's understood that they have a certain common denominator. Especially in our case, this Yochid, this individual, this Eved, he's part of Klal Yisrael. The difference will be that by the Shnas HaShvius of Klal Yisrael, so the idea of Shabbos LaHashem, the rest for Hashem, is in its most perfect way. And therefore it brings along with it all of the halachis of Shemitah. Whereas in a person's individual 7th year, this Eved, it's his 7th year, it's only similar to, in a smaller way, to the idea of Shabbos LaHashem of the Shnas HaShemitah. And therefore, it's only in regards to this particular idea that he goes out free from his slavery. And that's what the Zohar is saying, that when the time the land rests, the slaves need a rest. In other words, an Eved needs to go out, the slave needs to go out free on the 7th year from when he was sold, because he is part of the Klal, as we said, part of Klal Yisrael. He has a Chelek, a part of this idea of the land resting on the 7th year. He has it in the 7th year of when he was sold. He gets some of this in the 7th year when he was sold. He gets some of this menucha. Similar to the Shvius of Klal Yisrael, which accomplishes Naicha Da'ara, that the land rests. The Rebbe says, according to this, a Chidush comes out. The Rebbe says we need to really search and look if any Sforim mention anything like this. That when the year of Shemitah, when the 7th year of the Eved, would actually coincide also with the year of Shemitah, then the Shemitah, this idea that the land is resting, is causing that the slave, when he's going out free, is with a greater shleimus, similar to the examples we gave before. The Rebbe says we still need a tzarech iyun l'may nafkamina, what would be the practical difference, but the Rebbe says, ein kan makoimoy, this is not the place for it. But the Rebbe says, now it will be geschmack what the Zohar says, just in a plain, simple way, that by the rest of the land, the slaves need a rest, from which it sounds like the Zohar is speaking about the 7th year, Shnas HaShemitah Kapshuta. Because again, the Zohar is bringing the case when the freedom of the slave in the 7th year is in its most perfect way. Like we said before about Esfartim L'Chamimachras HaShabbos. Why does the Torah say Shabbos? Because that's when the mitzvah of Sfira is going to be in the most perfect way. When is it in the most perfect way by the Eved? When the 7th year of his selling, of the Eved, is also coinciding and coming out in the Shnas HaShemitah, the same time that the land is also resting.